So, my talk is divided in three broad parts. The first part, as I mentioned, will be the part that is really coming from my own field, the technological breakthrough part. And then we'll go really into things that I'm hoping are common preoccupation. We'll first of all see, well, what do people think about the technology? And where do they think we're going with this? And finally, I will say, okay, this is, what the experts are thinking, what the lay audience is thinking. Now, what can we do at this point in time? So the technology. Probably most of you have heard about CRISPR-Cas9. It's a breakthrough that's been happening in the field of genetic engineering. It's been a few years, but really it exploded last year. And what CRISPRs are they're adaptable immune systems that are used by many bacteria to protect themselves from foreign nucleic acids in the system, such as virus, plasmids, that confer resistance to foreign genetic element. And the CRISPR immune mechanism, it binds itself to an enzyme that cleaves DNA, which is called Cas9. And so, I mean, the best way I can picture this is if you look at the image on the left of the screen, it acts a little bit like scissors or like pincer, and you can cut the DNA at a specific place, and you can modify it as well. Now, that is the theory. And that's nothing, gene editing is nothing new. I mean, we've been talking about it for a year. But the difference is that with CRISPR-Cas9, all of a sudden, it's become much more simple, precise, and rapid in the way that it functions. It's much more accessible as a technology. And you see that demo slides there that says, what is CRISPR-Cas9? Use this technology, learn it from a 4-minute video. That doesn't sound very complicated, does it? And there are also kit and set that they're starting to sell as well for people that are do-it-yourself scientists and that are part of clubs that do science so that they could eventually have access to CRISPR-Cas9 if they wanted to. So that much is new. So why are we talking so in terms of scientific accomplishment? The big talk has been in 2015, so it's been used in China to edit the genome of non-viable human embryos to correct mutations that were causing beta thalassemia, which is a fatal disease. So it's been used. It's worked to some extent, but it didn't work perfectly. The problem is it led to what we call mosaicism, and there were some off-target effect. So what does that mean? Off-target effect means that it has cut DNA at place where it shouldn't have cut it. And mosaicism means that the result has been that some cells have been modified, some cells weren't modified. But all of this could eventually be perfected. The scientists are very positive about the possibility to improve this. Another experiment that has been much discussed has been an experience where they try to experiment with CRISPRs on fruit flies, and they tried to switch a gene that would change their color to yellow. And it worked to a surprising extent. 97% of the progeny of the fruit flies turned to be of a yellowish, pale yellowish color. What's the problem with that? Well, what if those fruit flies had been released in nature, had been able to escape? Given that the transmission was passed on to the offspring at such a high rate, it certainly is cause for concern, even though the lab said that they had taken all precautions in this particular case. And finally, it's been proposed that CRISPR could be used to make better human, not just prevent disease, which really asks a big question when we talk about health. What is it to be healthy? Is it only to be free of disease, or is it to be as good as you can be? let me be more clear and talk about really what the possibility of this technology is. And this is something that George Church, who's professor of genetics at Harvard, has proposed this list. Basically, this list is a list of 10 genetic variants. And if you have those genetic variants, you will develop what some people would say are super abilities. So, for example, one variant will give you extra strong bone. One variant will give you more lean muscle, insensitivity to pain, low odor production, virus resistance, low coronary disease, low Alzheimer's disease, low cancer, low type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And we can see the blurry line between what do you consider to be health and what do you consider to be enhancement right there on this list. And George Church says, and he's very positive about these things, he says we're about 10 to 20 years away from this. And that it's fairly simple and straightforward. Some people would disagree with him on that. Moving on. So what do the experts think we should do about this new technology? Two very different people with two very different agendas. The first one is Craig Venter, who was very active in the human genome, in the private component of the Human Genome Project, and is also a big believer in science, says, I think that human germline engineering is inevitable, and there will basically be no effective way to regulate it or control the use of gene editing technology in human reproduction. His standpoint is basically, we should let science progress, because only if we let science self-police itself will we gain knowledge, and with knowledge will come the wisdom that will guide us in our decisions toward the progress of technology. On the other side of the spectrum, we have Francis Fukuyama, who's an American political scientist and political economist, and is, I would say, on the conservative sort of side of the policy agenda. And he basically is saying the opposite. He's saying the speed and the scope of technological development can be controlled. And he's making a parallel with other technology, and he's saying many dangerous or ethically controversial technology, weapons, and nuclear power, and he gives example, have been regulated before and subjected to effective political control, and thus cannot be freely developed or traded. And this sense is that there should be strong national regulation in the different countries that would subject the use of what can be done with CRISPR-Cas9 and gene editing in general. What does the public think now about this new technology? Not a lot of data yet on what people want to do with this. I think that it's really early to ask these questions, given that the technological development are really recent for CRISPR-Cas9. We see here that 11% of the general public were in favor in a 2016 survey of legalizing intelligence enhancement through gene editing. So it's still a minority, a small minority, and 14% thought the federal government in the US should fund research on gene editing to improve characteristics such as intelligence or physical trait or athletic ability, for example. In 2015, there was another survey, a larger population sample, and this time it's really interesting because when asked about approving genetic modification in babies to reduce the risk of disease, so for therapeutic purposes, we see that 46% thought it was a good idea. So it's almost half of the population were ready to do it and accepting of this. On the other hand, when the question was asked about modifying baby to make them smarter, all of a sudden people were more reluctant, and 83% were saying that this was taking medical advances too far. What's going to be interesting is to see how this tendency will evolve over the next few years as people become more acquainted with technology. So from a policy standpoint, what are some of the issues that are raised by CRISPR-Cas9? And again, I think that there are some parallel we can and we should make with cybernetics, I think. Safety is one big concern. I gave the example of the fruit flies. The problem is, when the germline is modified and when the change can be passed on to offspring, if there are mistakes that are made and you're affecting the wrong genes and this is transmitted, we can see the kind of consequence and the kind of harm that this could have. Or you could purposely modify gene in a way that this technology can be used as a biological weapon. So there are definitely safety concerns with the technology, and it's not ready yet at this point in time to be used on human. There's a consensus on that in the scientific community. Equitable access. Of course, if eventually the technology becomes available and we start discussing about the possibility of enhancement, this is going to be expensive. I doubt that our healthcare system, which is already overburdened as it is going to be willing, I doubt our government will be willing to cover these enhancements. So who's going to be able to have access, and is that going to be creating new categories of privilege and underprivilege? Impact on human nature and human dignity, it certainly asks us, well, up to what point can we modify ourselves? What is it that constitutes a human person? And what it is that is constitutive of human dignity? And how do we preserve it? And should we preserve it? These are some big issues and that we need to reflect on in the longer term. And finally, well, at the policy level right now, what do we see? We see a variety of misaligned normative responses. Basically, there's no consensus. So this is where we are right now as we're speaking at the international level. So the country with the dark pink are those that have the more restrictive regulation, Canada being one of these countries. In Canada, it's currently a criminal offense to produce genetic modifications that are passed on to future generation. It's criminalized by the Assisted Human Reproduction Act. And in some other countries, the ban is done through guidelines. Those are the countries in lighter pink, and like China, for example. The problem with that is Chinese are very good at adopting guidelines and legislation. They're not so good at enforcing them sometimes. And here's where the problem comes in those countries. Finally, there are some countries that have adopted some administrative restriction. Again, it works. Sometimes restrictions on funding. You won't be funded if you're going to use the technology in a way that's disapproved by the government. That's the way things work in the United States, for example. So we're going to control the use of the technology through funding or through other means. And there are countries where it's simply not clear at the moment, and we're not sure how they're regulating genetic engineering. Finally, in Washington, in December of 2015, after the thalassemia gene editing experiment was done by the Chinese on human, it created a lot of controversy because some journal had actually refused to publish the result because it was an experiment on human that they thought were not ethical. And so they ended up publishing in another journal after Science had rejected their paper. And it raised a lot of issue for the international community. So there was this conference organized in Washington, D.C. in December of 2015. And people sort of gathered there, and the belief was that they were probably going to adopt a resolution to ban the use of CRISPR-Cas9. That's not what happened. They ended up agreeing on sort of a softer text where they said, well, it would be irresponsible to proceed with any clinical use of the germline editing unless and until the relevant safety and efficacy issues have been resolved. And they also said that that the clinical use, when we're ready to do this, and when the science is there, should only proceed under appropriate regulatory oversight. And the resolution continued to say, well, right now we're really not there at this point in time, but it's important to continue research, and eventually we might get there. So it's a much softer sort of resolution than what was hoped for. And so what do we do now? And I'm going to leave you with some ideas of where we could go. And again, I really want to hear from the people that are interested in health and cybernetics, health and nanotechnology. Is this sort of, are these things that you're familiar with? Is this the way to address some of these issues? So first of all, understand people's choice and preference regarding the technology. I think that there needs to be some broad consultation to familiarize people with these new developments. Science is progressing at such a pace that people are sometimes familiar with a new science, but on a very superficial level. And they're often misinformed about what the technology can actually do and what it cannot do. So consulting, engaging people on the new technology seems to be something that should be done as a matter of priority. Then I think there are some use of the technology that are clearly unsafe. Using it too early on human before the various issues of mosaicism and of off-target effect we've discussed are resolved. And there are using it as a biological weapon should be definitely something that we should not encourage. So there are easy bans that we can see there where law would definitely play a role. But the question of genetic enhancement is much more complicated. I don't think it's necessarily something that we're ready to address at the moment. I think it's part of the thing that you want to engage society in this broader debate, to know how people are perceiving this possibility, and to see how the general population would use it, and also what would be the impact on human nature, and also what can be done realistically and what cannot be done, because there's also a lot of possibilities that are discussed that are clearly of the realm of science fiction at the moment. And I think we need to eliminate those and focus on what's much more near us and much more tangible. And finally, as you saw the international patchwork, and that's a little bit of a concern, because there's always the risk that somebody that you're preventing to develop a technology or to use a technology in a certain way at home just move to another country and develop that technology anyway. So I do think that there's a lot of work. Research is international. You can't think at the national level nowadays. You really have to think at the international level if you want to be effective in addressing new scientific development. So that was my conclusion. Thank you very much.